You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hi there, and welcome back to Wildside, the official Mondo Macabro podcast. We had planned to do this in October, but with the Halloween sale, we got pushed a couple weeks, and now we're glad to share with you our Bollywood-centric episode. I am Ryan Verrill, and with me is Chris Haskell, who's always here.
Hello.
And we got a special guest this time. If you are familiar with any of the Bollywood horror releases from Mondo Macabro in this box set, you have likely seen the name, maybe seen the face, and heard the voice of one Mr. Tim Paxton. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I love coming on and talking about Indian movies, and try to smooth it out for people who are terrified of them. So.
There's a lot of people in that boat, so let's dive into that. How did you get so enamored with Indian cinema at the beginning?
It goes back really far. My mom was a hippie, pretty much, and I live in Oberlin, Ohio, which is a small liberal arts college. So there was a lot of like alternate religion, alternate stuff going on all the time. And what really got me interested in India is that we used to go to this Hare Krishna restaurant all the time. And I would see these comic books with all these blue skinned gods and everything. You were never able to buy them because they just had them for people to look at. But that piqued my interest. And I was a big monster fan since I was little because my mom was into monster movies in the 30s and 40s. So she made sure we always watched this sort of stuff. So basically, I kind of heard about Indian horror films, although the only real film from the area that I knew anything about was the Dracula in Pakistan, so-called movie.
Sure.
Because when I went to Indian video stores back in the 80s looking for any kind of Indian horror films, I was told there are none. That Indians don't make horror films; they make beautiful films. And, it wasn't until somebody sent me a bootleg copy of Varana on VHS that I got my full eye view of what the hell was going on, and it really got me interested. But in the 80s and 90s, it was so hard to find any Indian films. And the only time I was able to get any is I went through, I used to go through a Thai media place called E-Thai CD or E-Thai Media. I don't think they're around anymore. But they used to have Indian horror films that were dubbed into Thai. And that got me really interested. I mean, not a lot. Basically, they had mainly mythological movies, but so I was able to find a company that I was able to buy VCDs from, VCDs and some DVDs, and I ended up spending a lot of money for at least around 300 horror films
Wow.
from all over India, not just Bollywood films, not just Hindi, but in at least 7 other languages, which I don't understand any of it. It's all a blur with me. And so I got really, really, really into it. And as my past in publishing goes, I've published magazines since 1978. I started out with Photo Fiends, and they were always about monsters. And then there was a magazine called Naked Screaming Terror I did with a friend, Dave Tottarello. And we also did Monster, which is the first volume of Monster from the 80s. And then I stopped doing it and created Monster International. Did that for a while. And then bowed out of the magazine scene for quite a while until Brian Harris got a hold of me. And from, I guess it was Wildside Publishing then. But I think we had to change it to WK Books because I kind of integrated my company in with them. So I've always been interested in monsters. And this was a whole new world opened up to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up watching Japanese horror films and English science fiction, Spanish horror films, all that stuff. But Indian horror films, that just blew my mind.
Paul Nash is only making so many movies, I guess, right?
Oh yeah. And then it took a while to dig up the history on this thing, going back quite a ways.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things we should probably bring up is that one of the reasons that you're on here is because you're so heavily involved in this box set, not only on the discs themselves doing intros for the films, but the booklet itself. I was heaping praise on you before we were even recording, but this is one of my favorite booklets from the last couple of years because it is so it feels exhaustive in nature. Like if you want to ingest an entire history of an era of cinema, of a feeling of cinema, of a full I don't really want to say genre, but like a complete blind spot for most people that are fans of Western cinema. And it's contextual upon the context that is already there. And that is so enriching for me. How did you approach this? Is this something that was all new research, or is this something you had been compiling?
Well, I published for about 5 years a digest-sized magazine called Monster. And it was print on demand through Amazon. And every single issue, and there are 34 issues, maybe in 33 of those 34, I wrote about Indian films. And I also wrote a couple long, exhaustive articles for the magazine, our magazine, Wang's Chop as well. I did a big piece on about 100 possession movies that came out in India. So yeah, it's exhaustive. When I write about these things, I just jump right in and I do history. I love doing history and writing, and more of a scholar sort of thing, even though I don't know the language.
Well, and one of the aspirations that I've heard from you personally is that you want to go to India eventually and potentially live there. What's that dream all about?
Well, I've been to India several times.
Right.
I dropped down in 2018. It was my first time. I never really knew that much about the place. I just jumped on a plane and went.
Where'd you go?
I landed in Delhi.
Okay.
Which is a mind-blowing to be there because there's so many people. Yeah. In India, it's really hard to be anywhere alone. We'll tell you that because like 1 billion people are in one country.
Right.
I was in Delhi. I met with a couple people in Delhi, and then I just traveled around. I like going to temples. I like going to Hanuman temples, which is Hanuman's the monkey god, Hindu monkey god, and then I like Shiva temples. Shiva's the dancer of destruction sort of guy. Mm-hmm. Guy that people are always scared about. There's a great Hadron Collider in Europe, and what they have there, if anybody knows, that's a big scientific thing where they're splitting atoms and molecules to find various subatomic particles. But out in front of it, there's a huge statue of Shiva. And there's all this conspiracy theories about it because Shiva is known as the destroyer. So they're like, oh my God, they're going to destroy the world with this thing. Anyway. So I eventually, and then I ended up in Mumbai right before I left. I just went to about 8 different cities. And when I was in Mumbai, I had a film director named Vishal Faria contacted me. He just didn't know really who I was, but he saw that other people wrote about me and stuff on Facebook. And so I got to hang out with him, and I decided, well, guess what? I'm going to come back again because it was really fun. And I was in one of his TV shows that he directed, which is kind of fun. I was a background guy because they wanted a little bit of color in it, so to speak. I was the only white guy there, and it added a little punch to the scene, I guess.
If you're talking about traveling around India, that might be a good segue into something that you write about a lot, and I think is interesting. That people use Bollywood as sort of a generic term for Indian cinema, But there's a lot, because there's so many strong cultures in India, and each one of these cultures has quite a large population. They can support several different film industries, right? So there's like in the Punjab region, there's Bollywood, and they break it up kind of by culture and language, right?
Yeah, there's about 8 major studios. Marathi, which is they don't really produce much anymore, but they were the first. That was the first language industry that produced a bunch of movies in India, up until in that section, it was around Mumbai, until Hindi films took over, and of course Hindi's Bollywood. I like, and then you got oh my god, I can't remember what they call the films in Bengal. Some name I can't remember. It's so wacky. Everything ends in wood, like sandalwood, Mollywood. Mollywood is the Malayalam language, which is from the state of Kerala, and they produce probably the most forward-thinking and beautiful films. Even their horror films are gorgeous. And then you have the Tamil. You have the Tamil film industry, which is producing huge hits in India, and the Telugu film industry as well. They're just pretty all those really insane action films where everybody's moving in like slow motion to dodge bullets, and it takes like 5 minutes for the bullet to go past them while they're moving, and then they break into song after that. But, yeah.
Gotta love all those styles. With this box set, we bring together different horror movies, and not all just from the same era.
Well, they're all basically from the Ramsey family.
Right.
The first older ones are from the 80s, and one from the 90s, which is Macau, and then Atma is directed by the son of Tulsi Ramsey, Deepak. So, but yeah, they're all different eras.
That's why I love a box set like this, because it's sort of all-encompassing, a bunch of different styles, a lot of characters, a lot of like big pieces of folklore that have been impactful for generations. And again, if anybody is curious about this, I strongly recommend, before you even watch a movie, read the booklet front to back. The amount of interesting background that you get before you get started is great, but one of the things that, people that have never jumped into this because they're afraid would love to ask, what in your opinion, Tim, is the best jump off point? If you're, if you want to get into Indian horror and then just Indian cinema in general, if that's a different question for you.
Well, my favorite genres, besides the horror film, I'm really big into possession movies. I've written several articles for other magazines about possession movies since the 1980s. And India has not evil devil sort of possessions, but they have evil spiritual, or just spirits that kind of want to possess people. And that's there's so many ghost movies in India. I mean, they rival like Korea and about for all the ghost movies. And then I like the Nagan cinema, which is the Cobra Lady cinema. And I wish we could find some of those films, but there's a big problem about securing movies, securing negatives or even really good copies, positives of any movie. We're just really lucky to get these Ramsey films. So a good jumping off point would be, you can watch either like Virana or Purana Mandir to be able to kind of get an idea of what's going on. And unfortunately, most of their films, no matter the language, do not have English subtitles. Mm-hmm. So I sat through hundreds of these things without English subtitles, but you pick up words here and there, and most of the time the plot's pretty much the same for all the horror films.
Right.
So jumping off would be any of these Ramsey films. And then there's a director called Kodi Ramakrishna, who passed away recently. He directed Amaru, which is a really good, I call angry goddess cinema films. And that's really good. That's a good jumping off point because it gives more of the sort of mythological and sort of devotional side of horror films. And then, like I said, the ghost movies, the noggin films, and they don't have very many monster movies. That's just recently there was a monster movie called Creature 3D, and it was a bomb. But not that many monster movies since the Ramses made them, and I really miss that. But if you want to there are some more modern movies. There's one called Bhoot, Bhoot. It's done by Gopal Ramakrishna, who is really big he's a big filmmaker over there. And his first really good films were horror films or gangster movies, sort of. But if you can find a subtitled copy of Bhoot and of an earlier film called Rat, R-A-A-T, they were actually released in the U.S. on DVD from an Indian DVD company over here. So those copies are floating around. I know they're available on the gray market, and you may be able to get 1 or 2 copies on Amazon if you order them from Amazon UK.
Not me pulling up Amazon right now as you say that.
Tim, I'm curious on one thing on that. You kind of touched on this mythological piece, and that's a question I had for you, because one of the things that I think has been really interesting going through the set, reading your notes, listening to your intros and some of these, I think American horror films tend to borrow from literature a lot, right? You look at like Frankenstein, Dracula, a lot of the monsters, they're all kind of, the stories, we don't really have American folklore in the same way that some Asian countries have folklore that's 2,000 years old or something, right? Where we're pulling from tradition. So we borrow a lot from literature, but in these movies, in particular in the Ramsey films, I think, and I'd be curious if it extends beyond this, but it feels like these stories that they're retelling with kind of a modern twist or a modern lens are going to be very known for people that are watching it. Because it seems like they're all rooted in like religion and folklore, is it?
A lot of them are. India is really one of the more odd countries in South Asia in that they don't have a lot of monsters in their countries. Basically, spirits and gods and demons, but demons not in the form of Christian demons. They're different. They're like demigods. Because like in the Philippines, you have thousands of monsters. I mean, the most gruesome things in the world are there, and you have like the flying head with the entrails hanging out in Thailand and Cambodia, and they all have really cool monsters. In India, they had to make up monsters or borrow some of the things from basically English movies. For devotional movies, there is a feeling of it's really tough. They really don't have a lot of monsters from folklore that they pull from. They do pull from one called Chidal, which was shown in Varana, where her feet were backwards in one scene. That's a really popular ghost that happens. There are some monsters that kind of show up in Bengali films, because that's where if you want to find out about monsters, a lot of them are from West Bengal more than other places. And that's what kind of got me disappointed in watching a lot of these movies, is that I wanted more movies from their folklore, and because there is enough folklore out there for them to make their own films instead of copying U.S. movies or copying Korean films, which Indian cinema does a lot. Doesn't matter if it's Japanese, Korean, Spanish, whatever. They just steal plots right out. Just boom, steal it. And then they run with it, and no credit is ever given. If a director talks about it, he made this great movie. He didn't say he ripped off, some Korean film. to make it.
Well, Piranha Mandur, we're going to talk about today at some point, is one of those, right? That was a direct ripoff of a Nashi movie, right?
Oh yeah, and then also the Nashi movie was a sort of borrowed a lot from an American film from 1958, I think, called "The Thing That Wouldn't Die," which is about a head that's in a box of an evil wizard that someone digs up, just sort of like in Piranha Mandir, and the box tells people to do horrible things. The head in the box. So yeah, they do. And the Nashi movie, what was that? God, what was that movie called? Something of horror. Remember?
Yeah, you mentioned the name. I forgot to write it down, but it's like I wanted to go check it out. I'm gonna go try to find it because Nashi's films are getting more and more releases in the last few years.
I saw a lot of Nashi films when I was little well, not little, when I was a teenager. By the time they got distributed around in the U.S., you had Revolt of the Zombies or one of his other zombie movies. But yeah, I wish we'd have more of his films. But there are some parts of originality in that movie. I mean, they have to be able to tie in their culture into this. But yeah, there was blatant ripping off stuff, and that was one of them. Same thing kind of happened in Verana as well. Some scenes and some parts of it ripped off this American horror film from the 80s called Mausoleum. I don't know if you guys ever seen that film or not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I saw it at the theater once, and it stuck with me. And then I watched Verana, and I'm like, wait a second.
The Nashi film we were trying to think of is Horror Rises from the Tomb.
There you go. Yeah. That's a good one. And again, it's an evil wizard that gets his head cut off. So like Samri in that film, he it's the same thing. He's a horrible person, and he gets his head cut off, and because he's so evil, his power is so immense that his head stays alive for a couple hundred years, and someone finds it, and well, I can't say that unless you can swear on
you can say whatever you want on.
Shit hits the fan, and it's fucking here we go. See, I got to be careful because when I set off swearing, I can just go for 5 whole minutes.
We'll do the George Carlin intro with just the 7 swear words.
Words you can't say on. It was a record my parents got me.
Oh, really?
Oh, I love it. It was a great George Carlin album.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some words you can't use. You shouldn't use because they're compound words. Motherfucker and stuff like that. So
exactly.
Before we dive into Virana and Piranha Mandir specifically, for people that are hearing this and excited about what you've worked on, can they still find that anywhere? Is it readily available?
Monster, all the issues of Monster, at least the copy that the run, the second volume 2 that I did with Brian Harris and Tony Strauss. That is all available from issue 1 to issue 34. And I had to cut it off because even though I wanted to do it, my co-editor at the time, we're having problems with them. So we just stopped. But you can get all those from Amazon.com. Not to because it's print on demand.
Right.
Which is a blessing because back in the 80s and 90s, if I wanted to print something, you go to a printer, you had to spend, $10,000 to get, 8,000 copies. And I still have hundreds in my basement, still in boxes from printers.
Jeez.
Yeah. So, but print on demand, there's no overhead.
You should throw those up on an eBay store or something so we can link to them. Get those copies out of your basement.
Well, actually, I do. I have some issues of Monster International that I have left.
Perfect.
I think issue 3 and 4 are still available. 1 and 2 sold out, and they go for a decent amount of money on eBay if you can find them. So, anyway. So, yeah, my Wang's Chop, which I also wrote the articles on, the Cobra Lady films and the Angry Goddess films and the movies of Kanti Shaw, which He's great, man. He's like he makes junky movies, but he makes so many of them that it's just overwhelming. He rips off Indian films, his own country's films all the time.
Godfrey Ho style of filmmaking, right?
Oh yeah. Oh my God, Godfrey Ho. Yeah. Is there a box set of his stuff?
I don't think there's a box set, but there are more coming soon. I happen to know about a few.
Oh,
so.
okay, good. I love it.
My favorite, I know this is a huge tangent, so I'll be very quick with it. My favorite Godfrey Ho stories, he's a professor right now. So you can go take a class on film history from Godfrey Ho right now if you speak, I guess, Cantonese or, whatever, where I forget where he's set up.
Hong Kong is Cantonese.
Could be, I think he's in Hong Kong, right? It could be. So yeah, anyways, it's
that'd be awesome.
I want to learn Cantonese. I can't imagine sitting in his class.
Yeah, I want to know why he came up with Robo Vampire or whatever it was.
I'm sure he would tell you.
As this is a Mondo Macabro centric podcast,
yes.
Everybody's probably dying to know, how was it working with Mondo Macabro? How was it working with getting the videos in and getting the booklet in?
I've known Pete Toombs for quite a while. Since I produced Monster International, he reached out and contacted me, and we just talked on and off or communicated on and off for about 30 years. And then he reached out and he goes, we're doing this box set. We got some really good prints, some negatives from the Ramsey brothers, and we need, can you write a history of the Ramsey films? I said, sure. If I get to design it, I'll write it. And he goes, oh, go right ahead. So the whole booklet was, it's not just Ramsey movies, because those actually came like in page 40 or something of the booklet. It just I told him I need to describe the history of Indian horror films to be able to give you, the reader, some kind of a decent background about what's going to happen. So yeah, he contacted me on that. And then, we were talking, and I've done a cable horror TV show since 1988, and I still make Halloween specials on them because he knows. Then he's seen a couple of those, and I do a lot of ad-libbing when I do all of my intros because I'm not very good at reading a script, so I just go on off. So I did that. I shot that for him and created the magazine for him, and it was exciting. It was good fun.
I got to admit, the intros before every film have been genuinely helpful. After you've read the whole booklet, and just having that set up is so nice. I always love when labels take the time to get something like that, because it's, I don't know, to have the table set before you enjoy this potentially sumptuous meal of cinema is always a nice way to approach it. And
some of those intros, I try to touch on different things, and my hatred of comedy films, or of comedy horror movies, we'll put it that way. I think they're unfortunately now in Indian cinema, thanks to Tamil cinema, comedy horror films are like taking Indian cinema by storm, and they're horrible. Sound effects all the time. You're watching a live Warner Brothers cartoon on some of the things.
Before we move on too much from the booklet, I want to just call out that other than just being 80 pages of essay, which would be cool but might be a bit of a chore. There are at least 20 pages of just full. Like, you found amazing poster art.
Yeah, those are my
one sheets.
Those are from my personal collection.
Oh wow!
I bought all those things.
Wow.
And if someone's interested, I put out a book called Fantastic Films of India or something like that. And volume 2 is all of my horror posters. So it's about 200 pages of posters. That's up, just Google my name and it'll pop up. And the book previous to that was on VCD covers. And VCDs are these really crappy versions of what the Indians like to think DVDs were. And they were actually VCDs very low, highly compressed video that would fit on, you get about an hour and a half on one CD, not a DVD, but like a CD. And it took a lot of South Asia by storm. I mean, a lot of different countries had VCDs.
So I was living in Indonesia from the years 1996 to 2000, and you could get. They didn't have a above market, like a legitimate market of selling movies. The only ones you could get were bootlegs in the whole country for the most part. And so you had two options. You could either get a bootleg VHS, because a lot of people still had that, or you could go to a mall with like a huge mall with like golden doors and like millionaires shop there, and they had a video store in the mall, and they would just sell these VCDs with custom covers and everything. It was crazy.
It's beautiful. VCDs were very popular in India because they were cheap. You could play them on your computer. You can get these little players with tiny little screens on it. You can play it like that. It didn't have to have the technology of DVD, but the things looked horrible. But it doesn't matter. They loved it. You can find, sometimes you go to stores and they're just basically in trash barrels nowadays, because nobody buys physical media in India. The favorite way of watching things is on their phone.
Yeah.
But yeah, VCDs are awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into our box set then. The way they have this labeled, there are 6 different cases, and of course, for each of the films, you've got a disc 1, disc 2 connotation on the back. So we're going to start with Virana, because that is labeled as disc 1.
Okay.
Please, Tim, set the table for our listeners. What is Virana about?
Virana, the movie was made in 1988. Actually, it was made in about 1985, but it took about 3 years for it to clear the censors, because Indian film critics are very sensitive to a slight, a little bit of cleavage or something like that. They don't like it. So Virana is like a lot of the horror films of that time, and a little bit, before, but it mixes sex with horror. And Virana means dark forest or something like that. And in this dark forest is a cavern with weird monsters in it and a wizard. And they're trying to bring this witch back to life that was killed. And the witch is called Nikita. And even though Virana confused the hell out of me when I first heard about it, because I thought the monster was called Virana, but no, it's just the monster is Nikita. And she possesses a little girl that grows up to be, psychically has some psychic abilities, like blowing people's eyeballs out and things like that.
As one does.
Yeah. You bug somebody, you get your eyes blown out. It's probably their best film. It's a film I like. I like that, and then Prana Mandir after that. Actually, there's other Ramsey movies. They've made about 20 movies if you want to count all the offshoots of stuff. And the movie of theirs I really like, it's called Darwaza, and it came out in 1978, and it was basically the movie that kind of opened the floodgates for cheap movies. They all ripped each other off, and you go all the way back to that film. But you got to watch Virana, because in it is this actress called Jasmine.
Yeah. And
Jasmine is like a fetish idol for people. If you go on any of these Facebook groups or something, and if it's the Ramsey Brothers Facebook group, every 5 posts is a picture of Jasmine. and the mystique about it is that she was only in 2 movies. She was in a comedy, and then she was in Virana.
Yeah.
And then she disappeared. She probably left the country because she was probably being bothered by producers to sleep with her and things like that. But that is, Jasmine does play a character called Jasmine, and she is possessed, and she ends up killing several people before her family members and her sister and her boyfriend, I believe, they attack the wizard's enclave where the monster is. I can't give it too much away, and it does have some good musical numbers. Comedy is okay. Go on.
I saw, just by weird coincidence, I saw what was Ryan, help me out. What was the Indonesian movie about the Queen of the South Sea that we covered recently?
Lady Terminator.
Of course. Lady Terminator. And then this one. And then Death by Temptation, the American horror film from New York from the 80s. I just so happened to see them all together, and it's so interesting to see the different ways that essentially a succubus is portrayed, right? Mm-hmm. This kind of myth of like the succubus. Although I think Verona, it's supposed to be more of like a vampire kind of.
Yeah, kind of.
Sort of.
A succubus in Indian culture is not very common. But in European culture, there's always, sexy devils running around and luring people. And it's you're right. All three of those films have a really interesting female-based monster in it that are like sexy monsters.
Right.
And Jasmine is sexy, but when she turns into the monster, she isn't. It's pretty good. One of my favorite monsters.
One of my favorite scenes in that, but I just thought visually it kind of made me laugh, and it was very interesting, was every time they go down into the lair or the kind of the headquarters of where this monster is, there's these Stonehenge looking kind of figures sitting around the table.
Yeah.
What?
The cone heads.
The cone heads, exactly. And it looks like they're playing poker or something. They're just kind of hanging out.
It's fun, but they're not nothing. Nobody explains what they are.
No,
they just
not at all.
Yeah, they just move their heads and go, oh, yeah. And that's it. I don't know if it's some kind of they're trying to get energy together. It doesn't make any sense. And then there's that big statue of a devil with flames coming out of its mouth and stuff.
Sure. Just general like horror kind of images together in one set.
Yeah, I mean it for me it kind of works because it's pretty otherworldly when you see stuff like that. There's not very many Western films that approach horror that way. Mm-hmm. By throwing stuff against the wall and see what sticks, sort of thing.
It almost feels like a Bond villain's lair or something like that when they go
yeah. A specter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You expect Little Bill to come out any second, but
the other thing that made me laugh really hard was one of the best medical diagnoses I've ever heard in a movie. So they introduced the older brother, but he's a little person.
Oh, God, yeah.
I wrote this quote down because it made me laugh so hard. He said, "My brother was 10 when I was born," or maybe he's the younger brother. Anyways, and an earthquake shook the hospital.
Yeah,
he was so scared. He stayed. Oh, he was talking about the older brother who was a little person. Yeah. He was so scared that he stayed that height for the rest of his life.
Yeah. Oh, that was. I love that part, but man, that comedy's killer. I mean, especially with the character Hitchcock, not Hitchcock, but Hitchcock. Some weird trying to get around it. If anybody wants to know, in Verona, there's another character called Hitchcock who wants to be a movie director, and he's always lugging around books on horror films or horror stories. In fact, I even have some of the books he lugs around.
Oh, cool!
And he's always trying to set up scenes and trying to, the comedy parts are him setting up scenes, and there's a lot of weird innuendos and things like that. But I think one of the most interesting things about that is, again, in Indian horror films, they steal scenes from other movies. And if you remember, he talks about a dog monster running around. And there's a scene from the 70s invasion of the Body Snatchers where you have that dog with the human head shows up for like 5 seconds. And it's like, whatever.
See, that's one thing, especially with this entire box set. So many of the movies have, I hesitate to even call them subplots, but they have these completely disconnected plot lines that work for like 2 scenes and then have no effect on the greater overall story whatsoever.
and normally it's the comedy stuff. And you can actually, I was talking to Pete Toombs about this, you can actually yank out all the comedy scenes and it works great.
Make it a better movie almost.
You make a much better movie. You can take at least 25 minutes out of these things for that.
Well, and honestly, that's one of the most common arguments is that these are just simply a little too long. And if you didn't have that in there.
Director of horror films, Vinod Talwar, who was sort of like a rival of the Ramseys in the 80s. I interviewed him for Wang's Job. And I asked him that question. Why are the comedy scenes in there? Why are there so many of them? Why are they so long? And his explanation was in the Indian film culture, you can't have an entire movie, all of horror, all of thrillers or action films or anything like that. You have to break it up because people, it's going to hurt their atma or their spirit or something. You can't have people scared all the time for 2 hours in a movie. So you got to throw in comedy. And sometimes, like you said, the comedy shows up in the dumbest places. I mean, right when the monster attacks somebody, you cut to either a music scene or the comedy. And that's intentional in horror films, except lately, any serious Indian horror film now has very little comedy in it. If it is, it's just some stupid wordplay. And a lot of the music is not, they don't dance around as much. So.
But it might be an interesting thing just to quickly talk about the Ramseys a little bit, because Tulsi, these are all have listed as 2 directors, right? Mm-hmm. Tulsi and Shyam are both listed as directors. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of Tulsi's job to put in the horror and the music, right?
Yeah. He wasn't a director of a lot of the scenes. Basically, his brother did that. And he was sort of like a line producer where you come up with things that are going to work and you put it in and he does that. There's so many Ramsey movies that are not available. I keep saying that, but there's some really good ones out there as well.
I don't know if you would know this. I was trying to find, do you have any concept? Because the way that they're spoken of is that everything after Purana Mandir were essentially big commercial successes for the Ramseys.
Yeah.
But do you have any concept for are we talking about they put in 100,000 and got 1 million? Like, do you have any?
Yeah.
Some of them were like the 4th biggest film of the year, but I have no concept for how much money they were making.
Indian audiences are pretty fickle about how a movie is successful. Okay. Anytime they don't like a movie, it's a bomb. But like with Purana Mandir and Virana and a couple of the other ones, they were blockbusters, which means, it cost $100,000 to make, which is a lot back then. And they probably cleared a couple million.
Okay.
Wow.
But that was only for about 4 of their movies. And they made 20-some movies. And they basically gave up after Mahakal, which is like the Nightmare of Elm Street ripoff.
Right.
To do TV.
Interesting.
But they're influential. Their movies are really influential to a point. Because a lot of the older fans still revere the Ramsey brothers. Varana is the best movie ever. Then comes Purana Mandir and other ones, and they love it. But the younger kids, they don't understand it, and so a lot of this is just stuck in one generation.
Interesting. You had the way that they spoke about as I was reading about them, both in your booklet as well, just trying to do some research on it. You know, in Hong Kong, you had this concept of a Cat 3 film where if you got into Cat 3, it was difficult to break in to kind of more mainstream filmmaking. And in the States, that was the adult film industry. There's not a lot of people that transition from pornography to mainstream. And it had that similar vibe in the way people spoke about horror in the
Oh, really?
70s.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. But also, in a way, Indian film industry is like the Italian film industry, where you can have some people that showed up in, say, a Franco softcore film,
Mhm.
and then acted with Fellini. You know, I
Okay.
mean, it goes back and forth like that.
Okay.
Same with, I mean, just totally off subject. Like Ennio Morricone, you know, he's classic composer. He scored anything.
Sure,
He didn't
sure.
score soft porn. You do that. He would do monster films. He would do westerns. Blah 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 blah. And Indian actors are like that as well.
Okay.
Some of them are very big, and they show up in some of the non-horror films. But you're right. A lot of the people were sadly stuck in the horror films. But they made some money off of it. And they had fun with it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have to be a part of Bollywood or Tollywood or Pollywood or Collywood, like if you're making money, then it's working, right?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. And it's the Indian film industry is basically run by producers. Like over here, we think directors have, you know, all the power and stuff like that. And actually, it's the producers that do.
Interesting.
Because, you know, Event Horizon was shredded by the producers. And the new version of The Thing, which had, I guess, a bunch of CG that was added later over the practical effects by producers. Same thing in India. If a producer has to really, really like an idea, and when you make a movie, if it bombs, you don't get paid. So a lot of that's the thing in India. You get paid after a movie is released, depending on how good the movie is.
Interesting. But the Ramseys are fascinating to me though, because they just sort of, you know, they didn't use unions. They didn't go through the typical systems. They just kind of, I think my favorite story you mentioned in the booklet, I believe, is they just gave a copy of the 5 C's of cinematography to one of the sons and Joseph Maselli, and then they just went out and they just read the book and then learned how to shoot a movie, and then one of them learned how to do music, and like, you know, they just sort of, the family just kind of got together and like, all right, we're going to make our own little mini industry here.
Well, yeah, it's almost like in the 60s and 70s, all the companies that made movies for drive-ins, you had people that did everything. It's not like you said, it's not like unionized like it is today. And you know, the end credits have 10,000 people's names on it. You know, there were people like the Ramsey family that, you know, there was only 5 people in their crew. I mean, it's like early Herzog movies where there were only 5 people shooting it. He only had 3 people shooting Nosferatu, and a lot of it was him doing the handheld. So
amazing.
With Virana, is there any like little bits about the censorship that you could shed some light on? Because this is one that was cut quite a bit, right?
Yes, it languished in the censor bureau for about 3 years, and a lot of the cuts they used to be able to go online and go to the Indian censorship board, and you used to be able to download what was cut from movies. You know, 2 seconds of the woman's thigh. We don't like that. Cut it. A little too much blood squirting out of the head. Cut it. We don't like the scene here because you can see the side of the boob too much. Cut it. Piranha had a lot of cuts like that because it was probably one of the most sexual of the Ramsey brother films, because you had a female monster, like you said, like a succubus. All the other monsters in the Ramsey movies were, you know, male monsters, macho monsters. She used her sexuality and really, you know, tore people up because of it. And they edited a lot of those sort of scenes out. And because of her, a lot of the film industry in the 90s and early 2000s, especially by directors, really low-budget directors, they call them grade C directors, like Conti Shaw and people, their main monsters were women because that brings the sexuality into it. And it's all because of Varana. And I really can't tell you a lot of what was actually cut out. Unlike, sometimes if you slow the movie down frame by frame, you can see where they probably cut something out that was sexy. One of my favorite scenes where I had to slow the movie down was in one of their films called Dak Bangla, which is about a mummy. And the mummy has psychic energy and he blows people's heads up. But you don't really see the heads blowing up. They must have done it, like a scanner style. They were impressed by scanners. And they looked like they had a dummy that's head that just exploded. You only saw that in 2 frames if you slowed it down enough. Because the editors I read, they said, you cannot have this in there. Too much blood.
Interesting.
Too much blood.
Wow.
Interesting. I wonder, the editor, in Romeo and Juliet, they have it to where it's a watermelon. They show a human head and then they quickly cut to a watermelon with a smiley face and blow it up. Maybe you would need something like that to get it past the censor.
Oh, yeah. What's interesting, though, now is their version of Netflix and Amazon Prime and a couple of the other streaming services. You can now have nudity and blood galore in those things because since they're a broadcast streaming, they don't go through the film industry. They have their own little thing to go through. And although now they're trying to pass laws to get rid of it, but try to make them a little more tame. But if you watch some of the Indian TV shows the past 5 or 6 years, there's nudity, there's a lot of sex, there's blood, which doesn't bother me at all. But
it's really interesting though, because the president is Modi, right? The guy's name I believe is Modi right now.
Yeah.
And he's a pretty conservative guy, so it's interesting that in his regime there's that stream. I guess just because they're basically finding a loophole in the laws to go. Fascinating. And also,
you got to understand that India has like 24 states, and each of them has their own language and culture. It's like if we were here in the U.S. and, Ohio spoke a different language than somebody in Wisconsin, a totally different culture.
Right.
If you have somebody who's like the president says, well, I don't like what they're doing in Ohio, but in Wisconsin, it's okay. It's not going to fly because the people in Ohio will be doing their own stuff.
Right.
And in India, it's kind of like that too. Modi can be up there, and he is maybe controversial. He's a really hateful guy. He's very anti-Muslim. Mm-hmm. He also stokes
nationalists.
Nationalists, Hindu nationalists against Christians. Mm-hmm. It's just it's sort of like our politics in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not to get too deep into that, just to say it's interesting that service is coming up with a fairly conservative regime, but I guess that speaks to maybe that loophole will be closed. So if you want to go see Indian nudity, go find those streaming services quickly before they're taken down.
Well, okay, now we're going to talk about Indian nudity in films. Back in the basically 80s and 90s, and a little bit in the early 2000s, a lot of the films, when they were shown to street theaters, so like tent theaters and stuff like that for the poor people and stuff like that, a lot of the films actually had pornography edited into them while they're being, right before the film gets shown. They take a reel, they edit in like the monster having sex with somebody or doing something like that, and the audiences went crazy. They love that sort of stuff.
Interesting.
But that was the only way you can get sexy stuff in movies, and a lot of the grade A directors hated them because they were like, "Oh, that's awful." But I don't think there was any scenes like that in Purana or Purana Mandir or really any of the Ramsey brother films. I don't think there were any introductions like that. But when you get to some of the other directors that were grade B or grade C directors, that was their bread and butter. It's putting those sexy scenes and stuff and having people pay a lot of money to see.
Super interesting.
Well, I guess that does lead us into 1984's Piranha Mandir. This is disc number 4 in the set, and this one, fairly different movie overall from Virana, obviously. Why don't you tell us about this one, Tim?
Well, Piranha Mandir, like what Chris said earlier, it was one of those horror films that was like the 4th biggest grosser of that year for the Indian film industry, at least for Bollywood. Piranha Mandir, it's probably their most competent movie, I'd say. It has, even though it rips off, 2 other movies, it is, the plot is a little bit easier to follow.
Yeah.
It has less subplots. The comedy in it is okay. It's not like amazing, but it's okay. And it features this character called Samri, which was the evil wizard, and he is a sort of a horror icon now. For a lot of people, look back in the 80s and they think about horror films, they think about Samri. It was a major blockbuster.
This movie is kind of crazy because it has a little bit of everything.
Oh yeah.
Very much a kitchen sink type movie. I mean, lots of martial arts type scenes.
Well, they like to call it masala.
Okay.
Masala cinema, where masala spices. You put spices, tons of different spices in something.
Yep.
So yeah, you're going to have kung fu in it, and really bad kung fu. I mean, it's.
I don't know, that guy Puneet Isar is kind of a heartthrob. He's when he's I feel like he should have had a sub career. Well, I mean, maybe he does because he's in over 150 movies. But
yeah.
he was, he had a good presence on the screen, even though the choreography probably wasn't, it's not up to the Hong Kong level. But he had a good presence as a hero. He had that kind of, the way they shot him. He just looked big, and he was muscular, and you believed he was going to kind of be a hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He had a pretty good career. It's, I don't know what else to say about Piranha Mandir other than that it's good. It also produced some music that they like to recycle over and over and over in all their other movies and TV shows. The opening theme is like sort of opening theme went back to Virana. So like in Virana, it was created, but it got really overused in Piranha Mandir and all the other ones after that.
It's a good theme.
That's a great theme. They used it for their Z horror show, their TV show. It had like 150 episodes or something like that.
Wow. Yeah, it's an one.
The big thing for me watching this one is just how appreciative I am for the location shooting. There are so many beautiful places that they just had the wonderful fortune of, let's just stand in front of this gorgeous temple and get some amazing shots. And
a lot of them were basically temples that were on sort of like somebody's property, because a lot of the temples aren't owned by the government or anything. They actually can be on people's property. So they got to shoot in those. They got to shoot in a couple mahals, which are mansions. You just, pay a little bit of money, stay there with your crew, pick out the scenes you want to do, do everything within 3 days or something, in this hotel, in this mansion, shoot everything on, just basically on that ground. And there's a lot of different beautiful scenes in it. I mean, Gangu Ramsey, the guy who did the cinematography, took this film and really outdid himself on a lot of the stuff. He's sometimes called the Mario Bava of Indian horror films because it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous to watch.
Last half hour, particularly for me, was a favorite. Like, that's where all the horror really ramps up. And man, did they love their fire in this movie.
Oh yeah. That's one good way to get rid of monsters and anything is fire. I mean, they took that whole thing with the Frankenstein monster being scared of torches and just went wild with it. You know,
I feel like in my mind, one of the other movies they made was called Pirani Haveli, more like a haunted house, a haunted mansion kind of. And for me, like that one leaned a little bit too heavy into the love story. I felt like they just sort of, I don't know, kind of took me out of it a little bit. This one, I feel like the reason it was the most successful, I'd probably also call it my favorite. I feel like they just got the balance of everything right. Like it was just it did have a lot of randomness in it, but they were just they kept moving along the story. Like they didn't have any huge detours in Piranha Mender. I felt like it was just, when they introduced a character, they very quickly brought them back into the story, and there wasn't too many sort of what's it called, like where you whiplash, where you're just kind of going back and forth. So that's to me, that's what I would, not that you directed the question to me, Ryan, but that to me, like that's almost where I would tell people to start if they're interested in getting into like the Ramses, because it just feels like the easiest transition into like this Indian style of movie making, where you're not having to pay so much attention just to keep up. You can kind of just relax into the movie and let it happen.
at least, and that's sort of like the '80s style in it.
Yeah.
Then the '90s changed everything, and then it got wilder sometimes after that. But yeah, Piranha Mandir is also, it's the most cohesive. Like you said, the most cohesive of the films.
It's also just very well done. Like there's so many pretty visuals. I mean, even like the monster or villain here is actually one of the more effective from what I've seen from some of the Bollywood stuff. It's actually creepy. It's done in a way that doesn't feel cheesy or like quickly or under budget or anything like that. It's really well put together.
They spent time with the cinematography in this one. A lot of the early ones, they really didn't, but this they really pushed the envelope. And it created a very, like I said, a very memorable monster. In fact, there was another film called Samri 3D, which was their 3D movie. They tried to do a 3D movie. It didn't work very well. But this character in this movie was called Samri, even though he had nothing whatsoever to do with the other one. And that's how they tried to bring in audiences, by just mentioning that this one monster, which was a good monster, by the way, he killed all the bad people, which people just didn't, they weren't into that. But it was kind of a ripoff because people expected to see Samri. And it didn't happen.
But they, not only the bad guy, Ryan, which is, I agree was awesome, but they also do this interesting thing in Piranha Mandir where there's like this community of people that are staying close and kind of, because the whole thing takes place in an old mansion or old temple that's been functionally deserted by the family, and then it kind of goes forward 200 years to where they're living in the city, and it's bad things start to happen, so they have to go back to that temple or that house and figure out what's going on. And there's a group of people that are kind of staying in that area and almost like protecting the house, and they are all having some sort of disfigurement, and they're kind of these ambiguous characters where you're not sure if they're bad guys or good guys, and I think that tension carries on pretty well. And it was, I don't know, it made the movie interesting. Like there was another layer there where you're trying to kind of figure out how they fit in and who they're helping. And I don't know, I thought there was, again, another random thing they threw in, but it was
their tightest script.
Yeah.
Everything, like you said, there was very little leftover from shooting.
Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for your time today. Recently, over the last year, I was able to work on getting you involved in something else. I really wanted to let people know that this is still happening because the title was kind of soft announced a little while ago and people are still asking for it. You did the commentary for The Devil's Sword, which is upcoming Blu-ray release from TerraVision. Thanks for doing that for us.
Oh, it was fun. And man, Indonesian names are a nightmare to try to pronounce. I had a hard time with a lot of this because I mean, I wrote about the Indonesian films before, but I didn't have to speak out loud. I mean, I'm like a scholar where you just sit and you write things, and you don't
Right.
get up in front of people and tell them. You go, this is Joe Schmo, blah blah blah. But I had a hard time. I had a really hard time on that commentary.
Well, I'm excited for people to see it. I know I've had a lot of people asking me if it's still happening, and you're going to round out a really great package, and can't wait for people to get their hands on it.
Oh, cool! I mean, it's a really cool film. I mean, just watch for the Cyclops. That's all I'm going to tell you. Watch for the Cyclops. It is. It may look like paper mache, but maybe there are some monsters that look like paper mache or look like Hello Kitty or something like that. Those are the monsters out there. Sort of like killer clowns from outer space.
There you go. Tim, anything else about Bollywood or Piranha Mandir or Virana you'd like to share with our listeners today?
With Bollywood, you have to understand that each estate has their own cinema, like I mentioned before. And at that time, when these movies came out, there were other horror films that came out in the state of Kerala, which produced some beautiful movies, beautiful horror films. They're just weird horror films. But in Virana, I think Virana and Piranha Mandir would be the best doubleheader that you would have to watch. I think they've been able to do the chapters where you can actually skip some of the comedy. If you hit the forward button, I think it goes a little bit past the comedy to get through that. But
mostly in Virana.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was the first time I ever watched an Indian horror film, and I sat there and I was going, oh, this is pretty good. And then they cut to like a pie fighting scene or something. and it's like you sit there going like, wait a second. What's happening? I mean, I didn't mind the musical numbers, but like you said, at least in Virana and Piranha Mandir, it is not as bad as in Mahakal. That one's really bad. I have a hard time getting through that movie. It took me two times of watching it to actually go all the way to the end, which I found was pretty anticlimactic, but
Chris, anything else you'd like to share with the listeners today?
No, I think you said something, Ryan, early on that I wanted to make sure we highlighted, which is the amount of research and thought that went into that booklet. I just want to really call out Tim, and I want to draw people to kind of whatever you want to have them look at in your work, because I like the way you write. I like the way you speak. It's academic without being boring. Like, I think you have a nice voice in the way that you approach this work. And you tend to really celebrate it, which is nice. That there are some pure academics that it feels like they hate it, even when they're kind of getting into the history of it. But I don't know, you have a nice way in the way that you speak and the way that you write. It makes it fun to read. And
it's like I said, I've been writing since the 70s on horror films. And it's always been that sort of thing. I mean, why, if I'm going to tell somebody there's a really shitty scene in a movie, I'm going to tell them it's a really shitty scene. Yeah. Even if the movie's classic.
Yeah.
And writing about Indian films, a really fun thing was that I knew very little about them. Unlike writing about Japanese films or Spanish films I grew up watching, I knew all that crap. It took a lot of research to do that. And especially in this booklet, when I had to try to piece together a history of it, and where it led up to the Ramsey brothers. Yeah. And you had the Ramsey brothers basically dominating the horror scene for almost a decade before the new crew came in, like Ram Gopal Varma.
I guess last thoughts. Any thoughts on the modern movement of Indian cinema? Like, suddenly, obviously RRR was a huge hit, but it seems like we're getting more and more theatrical showings in the U.S. We're getting more attention to these. Netflix is actually carrying quite a lot of the titles.
There was actually a couple really good. There was a really cheesy ripoff of Evil Dead that was on Tubi. Tubi shows occasionally. They show Indian horror films. The reason why I think a lot of these movies are opening up over here more and more in the past 10 years is that the population of South Asian population has grown, especially around here. But there's 30 miles from here, there's a really big population of Indian families. And of course, there's a theater there.
Right.
It's something that's just becoming more universal, too. I think people aren't scared of watching them as much as if they saw it in the 1980s. And I think a lot of that has to do with the internet and that people can be exposed to different cultures without being terrified of what the hell they're watching.
I'm really excited for that. I'm excited for more of these to get subtitles. That's a big thing for a lot of people.
It's something that'd be great. I would love to put together a box set of this South Asian director called Baby. A Baby, that's his name. But he was the Ramsey brothers sort of Kerala, of Southern cinema.
Oh, cool.
And he put together some really cool films. Those I would love to see. In fact, when I was in Kerala recently, I was going to talk to Baby died a couple of years ago, but his brother owns the rights to it. So I was going to go and try to talk to his brother, but that didn't happen because it's really hard to talk to Indian producers about films because they want so much money up front. And that's why there weren't that many Indian horror films on streaming on channels like Netflix and stuff until the past couple of years when.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they just decided to bring the prices down, I guess. And now there's just so many good ones out there. There's a good one called Tambad from 2018. It's actually really good. It's a really folklore-based horror film. It doesn't have comedy in it. Doesn't have musical numbers in it to speak of. It's just straight ahead, really good, almost like Italian in a way. But it's a good film, and it's based off of folklore, like if Chris was interested in. That's good. There's a bunch of films out there nowadays you could watch.
Don't tell anybody. I got a bootleg of that about 3 feet from me right now.
Oh, okay, that's okay. I got a director screener from somebody from a streaming service we will not mention that is very popular.
Well, again, the whole basis for this whole conversation today was the Ramsey House of Horrors Bollywood Horror Box Set from Mondo Macabro. And the hard part here is we are a couple of years after the original release now. So this is sold out at a lot of the common retailers like Grindhouse Video and Diabolic and Orbit. Amazon still has some. They are inflating the price a little bit.
They are.
It's up to like $160 at the moment. But if you remember the last episode with Jared, he did say he had a small amount that he was going to be able to list on the website in the near future. So keep an eye on that. It should be back for around 120-ish, I think.
And also, there aren't any Ramsey brothers that I know of, Ramsey films on Netflix. There aren't any on Amazon Prime or Tubi. There are all the other Indian horror films. So to be able to watch these movies, you're going to probably have to buy the box set, which is cheaper in the long run because if you try to buy the CDs or DVDs that Mondo Macabro released back in the 90s, they cost up to $200 a piece now.
Yeah.
So. And plus, you got really nice, cleaned up films.
Yeah,
and you got my inane introductions to these movies, and there's so many extra bonus features. A friend of mine, Sandesh Shenoy, who runs Bollywood Crypt, he was able to get a hold of about 5 or 6 actors that were in Varana and Purana Mandir, and interviewed them. And also a couple of the comedians he interviewed. I mean, his interviews really spice up this box set as well. Just going to say.
Well, appreciate that. Again, thanks for your time today, Tim. This has been awesome to be able to have your words speak on these.
Okay. Hopefully I wasn't too, so once I start talking, I can ramble. So
You did absolutely great. I'm sure people are going to love this. Thank you all for listening. We will get another episode out in about a month where we'll be covering 2 more Mondo Macabro titles. We'll do what we can to get those announced in the description of this episode, and we will look forward to seeing you for that one. In the meantime, have a good month, and we'll see you then.
okay, see you guys later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Yep. Bye-bye.
The audio commentary. It's a dying art form, but here at One Track Mind, I, your wonky yet affable host Ryan Luis Rodriguez, analyze film through the prism of these embryonic forms of podcasting, one audio commentary at a time. Masterpieces, crapster pieces, live action, animation, cult classics, films literally no one has ever heard of. No track is too small, and no track is too big. Join me and my guests from the entertainment world as we keep these features alive every other Tuesday. Hey, who else is going to discuss Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey one week and Citizen Kane the next? Us, that's who. Sure, you have to put up with my voice, but there's a certain give and take in this industry. That's One Track Mind, part of the Someone's Favorite Productions family and available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description